The audio begins before the picture does. A faint hiss of wind, water moving in slow, uneven laps against the rocks. Then there was a voice, young, nervous, whispering into the dark. Something along the lines of, "Okay, okay, I'm here. I'm recording if anything happens." Then there was a sharp inhale. "You said you lived here before?" And then there was a pause. The sound of gravel shifting under someone's shoes. Then the unmistakable creak of a wooden board, like a dock shifting under weight. Another voice entered the recording, but it's impossible to tell if it's human, low, breathy, almost like someone exhaling directly into the microphone. Then the recording ends abruptly, and this is the last known moment of Rachel Danner, age 26. Her phone was found the next morning on the riverbank, screen cracked, battery dead, half buried in the mud. The police initially believed she slipped into the river, but the audio, once it was enhanced, suggested something else entirely. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that whispered back. Stillwater is the kind of town people describe as quiet, safe, or unchanged. It was like a postcard city. They had antique shops, cobblestone streets, and a river that looks peaceful from a distance. But the St. Croix River has always had a darker reputation among locals. Old fishermen talked about whirlpools that would appear without warning, kayakers mentioning sudden drops in temperature, and every few years someone goes missing. But nothing prepared the town for what happened between 2012 and 2015, a series of disappearances that would eventually be linked by a symbol older than the town itself. The symbol appeared to be in wax, stamped on envelopes that no one could trace. The symbol belonging to a man who had been dead for over 2 decades. Rachel was a barista at a small cafe on Main Street, lived alone in a studio apartment above a bookstore, walked to work every morning, and spent her evenings stretching by the river. She wasn't the type to disappear. Her coworkers described her as steady, predictable, and quiet but warm. Her landlord said she had always paid rent early, and her sister Rachel said she had recently become distracted, often staring out the window as if she was listening to something or someone far away. 3 days before she vanished, Rachel received a letter. It had no return address and no postage stamp, just her name written in neat, old fashioned handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a symbol drawn in black ink, a circle with four intersecting lines like a compass without letters. Rachel showed the letter to her coworker, joking that it looked like something from a clock. But later that night, she searched the symbol online for over an hour. Her browser history showed dozens of variations: old compass symbols, navigation sigils, and Minnesota river symbols, and also the Stillwater missing person symbol. But she found nothing in her search. 2 nights later, she walked to the river at 2 a.m. Her phone recorded the last 40 seconds of her life. Detective Laura Merrick was assigned to this case. She'd been with the Stillwater Police Department for 8 years and had a reputation for being methodical, almost excessively so. Listened to the audio recording more than 50 times. Noted down that Rachel's breathing was fast but controlled. She was speaking to someone or thought she was, and the creaking sound was so consistent with the old wooden dock near the river's bend. She was also hearing the whisper at the end that was not Rachel's voice, but something else entirely. It was close, almost too close, as if somebody leaned directly into the microphone. But the most disturbing detail came from the audio technician who enhanced the file. He isolated the whisper and slowed it down. It wasn't a word or a breath, it was a name, and it said Rachel. For 3 days, divers combed the river. They found nothing. There was no clothing, no body, and no signs of struggle. The only physical evidence was the phone and a single footprint in the mud that did not match Rachel's shoe size. It was larger, wider, and deeper, as if someone who made it was carrying much weight. The print led toward the water and then simply stopped, as if the person walked straight into the river and vanished. 6 months later, on a fog covered morning, a dog walker found a leash tangled around a tree near the same river bend. The dog, a golden retriever named Jasper, was barking frantically toward the water. Its owner, Mark Ellison, was nowhere to be found. Mark was a retired post worker, 62 years old, known for his routine: walk Jasper every morning at 5:30 a.m. His wife reported him missing at 7:15 a.m. when Jasper returned home alone, dragging the leash. Detective Merrick immediately noticed a pattern. Both victims disappeared near the river, both were last seen at night or early morning, and both had received letters. Mark's letters was found in his mailbox. They were unopened. Inside was the same symbol, same compass, and the same circle stamped in black ink. This time, the envelope was sealed with a wax, red wax stamped with the same symbol. The wax was old, chemically consistent with formulations used in the 1970s, but the chilling part, the fingerprint embedded in the wax, belonged to Detective Alan Pierce, a man who had died in 1980. When the fingerprint analysis came back, Detective Merrick assumed it was a mistake, a lab contamination, or a smudge, anything but what the report had claimed. Fingerprint match was 98.7% accurate. Name Detective Alan Pierce and status deceased 1989. Pierce had been a Stillwater detective for nearly 15 years before drowning during a rescue attempt on the St. Croix River. His death was ruled accidental. His body was recovered, and he had a funeral. He also had his own headstone made. And yet, this fingerprint was embedded in wax on a letter delivered to a man who vanished 23 years later. Merrick drove to the cemetery after that. Pierce's grave was undisturbed, and the soil was compact, the grass grown over, and nothing suggested tampering or messing with. But the wax seal, that symbol pressed into it, was identical to the one Rachel received. It was a circle, four intersecting lines, a compass with no letters, and a symbol that would soon define the entire investigation. Stillwater is a small enough town that rumors spread faster than official statements. Within days, locals whispered about the river taking people again, a phrase Merrick had never heard before. When she asked older residents what it meant, they shrugged it off. Old stories or river nonsense, don't worry about it. But one man, Elias Crow, aged 78, gave her a different answer. He told her, "You are looking in the wrong place," as he was leaning on his cane. People don't disappear in the river, they disappeared near it. That is a difference. Merrick pressed him, but he refused to elaborate. He only said one thing: ask about the letters. They always send letters first. By the time the third disappearance occurred, Merrick had already begun piling a timeline, mapping the victim's last known movements and cross referencing any shared patterns. But nothing prepared her for Lucy Hartman. Lucy was 19, a college freshman home for the summer. She worked part time at a bakery and spent most evenings with her friends. She wasn't the type to wander off alone. On July 18th of 2013, Lucy told her mother she was going to bed early, and at 2:47 a.m., her bedroom window was found open. Her phone was on the floor and her shoes still in her closet, but her bed was completely empty. Her mother found a letter on the windowsill, same handwriting and symbol, and the same red wax seal. Inside was a single sentence, and it said, "You hear it too." Lucy's phone contained a single audio recording, time stamped at 2:31 a.m., 16 minutes before she vanished. Recording was 22 seconds long. It began with Lucy whispering, "Mom, are you awake?" Then footsteps, soft, hesitant, crossing her room floor, and the second of her window sliding open. There was a cold gust of wind and a faint splash in the distance. And then a voice, male, low and almost conversational. "Lucy." Wasn't shouted or whispered, just spoken as if the speaker were standing right beside her. Recording ended with Lucy gasping. Three victims, three letters, and three disappearances near the river. Merrick created a timeline. Rachel received her letter 3 days before vanishing. Mark received his 2 days before vanishing, and Lucy received hers the same night she disappeared. The intervals were shrinking, and they were losing time. Someone or something was accelerating. Merrick sent the symbol to historians, archivists, and symbolologists. Most dismissed it as a stylized compass, but one expert, a retired cartographer named Dr. Samuel Rourke, offered a different interpretation, that it is not a compass, it is a locator, a boundary marker. She asked him what a boundary for it was, and he hesitated, told her for places where people should not go. He explained that the symbol resembled markings used in the early 1900s by surveyors to detonate unstable ground, dangerous currents, or areas where the terrain was prone to sudden shifts. The version on the letters was older, much older, like the late 1800s, he estimated, possibly earlier. When Merrick asked if the symbol had ever been used in Stillwater, Rourke nodded yes, said yes on the river maps, ones they don't print anymore. Stillwater's Historical Society kept a basement archive of old maps, hand-drawn river charts dating back to the 1860s. Most were faded, water damaged, or incomplete. But one map, dated 1884, caught Merrick's attention. It showed the St. Croix River with dozens of markings along the banks. Most were standard notation, depths, changes, and current speeds, and also hazard points. But near the riverbed was the same bend where Rachel and Mark vanished, same symbol, compass-like circle, or intersecting lines drawn in thick black ink, and next to it handwritten notes, Pierce's Crossing, unstable. Merrick froze. Pierce, same name as the dead detective whose fingerprint appeared on the wax seal. Merrick dug into Pierce's personal file. He had been a respected detective, known for his calm demeanor and meticulous work, but in the months before his death, his behavior changed. He filed multiple reports about unusual activity near the river. He requested additional patrols along the riverbed. He interviewed several residents about strange letters they have received. Colleagues dismissed it as stress, and his captain ordered him to take time off. 3 weeks later, he drowned while attempting to rescue a teenage boy who had fallen into the river. Witnesses said Pierce dove in without hesitation, but something pulled him under quick. The boy survived, but Pierce did not. His body was recovered downstream, tangled in reeds. But the autopsy revealed something odd, something they have never seen before. Lungs contained absolutely no water. He hadn't drowned, but he had suffocated, as if something had crushed the air out of him before he ever touched the water. The fourth disappearance didn't fit the pattern. Daniel Price, age 34, vanished from his home on the opposite side of town, nowhere near the river. His wife found him missing at 4 a.m. Back door open, the porch light shattered. Daniel had not received a letter, at least not one anyone found. When he had received was a phone call, single missed call at 3:12 a.m. from an unlisted number. Phone records showed that the call originated near the river bend. When detectives traced the signal, they found something chilling. The call came from a phone belonging to Detective Alan Pierce, a phone that had been destroyed in 1989. By the late 2014, Stillwater was in a full panic. Residents avoided the river. Parents kept children indoors. Local businesses closed early. Police department held town meetings, but answers were scarce. Theories spread. Serial killer, cult, maybe a copycat, or a supernatural presence that couldn't be explained. Many believed it could have been a cover-up involving the police. But Merrick knew one thing. Disappearances were connected. The letters were connected. The symbol was also connected. And Detective Alan Pierce, dead for 25 years, was somehow at the center of everything. On February 9th, 2015, a jogger found a backpack near the river. Inside were textbooks, a wallet, and a letter sealed with red wax. Victim was Evan Laird, 29-year-old photographer. Apartment was found in disarray, furniture overturned, carpet cut into squares and stacked behind the water heater, camera equipment scattered across the floor. His camera was in the bathtub, still recording. Footage would become the most disturbing piece of evidence in the entire case. But that comes later. For now, all Merrick knew was this: River had taken another one. The letters were arriving faster. By early 2015, Stillwater PD was drowning in public pressure. They had three disappearances, coincidences, and four of them was a pattern, but five is a crisis. And when Evan Leard vanished, the FBI stepped in. They called for Special Agent Rebecca Hale. She was assigned as lead, and she was known for her composure. She was a woman that could walk into a crime scene with a body on the floor and treat it like a math problem. But even then, she still seemed like she was unsettled by this case in Stillwater. And they said her first move was to request all the letters received by the victims. And when they handed them over to her, they were carefully sealed in evidence bags. And she studied them for like hours after speaking to everyone. And she told everybody that they're not threats, they're like invitations and stuff. And people were asking, like, what do you mean by invitations? But she didn't have answers for any of this stuff. And the forensic lab in Minneapolis, they analyzed the letters in very, very deep detail. And they said that the results were baffling. Like, the papers were handmade, they were cotton based and chemically consistent. They said that they were made like in the 1970s. They weren't modern or commercially available to anyone. So, and they said the ink on there was like iron gall or some formula used in 1800s. They said it wasn't contemporary pens that are now used in the modern era. And they said that when the handwriting analysis was was done, it concluded that like the letters were written by the same people, and they all showed signs of age, tremors, and inconsistent pressures. And they said that the styles all matched from the same mid 20th century. And when they did a detailed analysis on the seal, the wax seal that was on the letters, it was old and brittle and it was chemically degraded. And they said that it was, in fact, the fingerprint embedded by Detective Alan Pierce. And it was coincidental because the man he died in 1989, so they had no understanding of how this was possible. And they said that the symbol was drawn in such a precision. It wasn't like sketched or stamped, but they said that the stamp itself that created it was never found. Like, no matter all the searching they did, they never came across it. And Agent Hale and Detective Merrick, they visited the Margaret Pierce house and they talked to the widow of the detective, Alan Pierce. And they said that she lived in a small house. It was on the outskirts of town. It was surrounded by like her home had like many and many of photos of her husband. And they showed her the letters that he had left. And they said that her face was pale. And she told them that, yeah, I've seen this symbol before. And Merrick asked her, the detective Merrick was like, where did you see him at? And they said that she had retrieved a small wooden box from her bedroom. Inside were several old documents. They said that Pierce's personal notes and sketches and maps, but they said that one stood out to them. It showed the same symbol, and underneath it, Pierce had literally written "boundary marker, do not cross." And his wife, ex-wife now widower, explained that in the months before his death, Pierce became obsessed with the river. He claimed that he heard voices near the water at night and whispers calling his name. And she remembered him saying, he said the river wasn't right. He said it was something moving in it and something else was in there besides water. And the detectives, they glared at each other out of confusion. And then they said that they remember asking, did he ever mention these letters? And his widower said, yeah, he said people were receiving warnings, and he said he was next, and he was scared. And the FBI wound up deploying sonar equipment for the riverbed where the disappearances occurred because they wanted to know what was down there. And it said that it revealed something unexpected. There was like a large metallic object submerged near the riverbed. And at first, they assumed it was just debris, like, it could have been a car down there or a boat or something mundane. But they said that as they did the sonar, they wound up noticing that the object was way too clean, way too rectangular. And they wound up finding a container down there. And they said they sent the divers down there, and they said the water was extremely cold, like near zero cold temperatures, and it was just strange. They said that the overall experience was overwhelming, and they said that the current wound up being stronger than they expected, and it was pulling divers way off course. And it actually took them several attempts to actually reach this object. And by the time they got to it, they realized it was like a steel storage container. It was rusted, and it had clusters of rocks near it, and it was chained to those rocks. And they said that the chains were very old, like very, very old, and but they were still intact. And they said that when they investigated and finally opened up this container, it said that it took hours to pry it open, but when they finally investigated it, they found everything that belonged to the missing people. Like they said that they found a wristwatch and sketchbooks and shoes and camera lenses. And they actually found Polaroid photographs in there. And they said that the Polaroid photograph was the most mysterious thing because it literally showed a man standing on a riverbank, and he was wearing his long raincoat and his face was obscured. And but they said that the outline was unmistakable. It had to have been Detective Alan Pierce. And they said that the photo was dated. It had to have been old, from 1989. It was from the year that he passed away. And they took the Polaroids to analysis, and they wound up finding out that the film stock was consistent with the Polaroid 600 film that was manufactured in 1980s, and the chemical degradation matched the photo exposed to moisture well over 20 years ago. And the timestamp, it was definitely authentic. It wasn't digitally added or anything spectacular, and they did the facial recognition on software, and it 94% matched the Detective Pierce that had gone missing in 1989. And it matched the exact location where Rachel's phone was found. And they said that the most disturbing detail was discovered when the image was enhanced. And it said behind Pierce in the darkness, there was a faint outline. There was another figure. It was tall and thin and standing unnaturally still. Proportions were all wrong. It was too long in the limbs and too narrow in the torso. And they said its head was turned directly toward the camera. It was visible. And they wrote down that internal memo summarizing the findings. And later, the memo revealed anonymously to a local journalist that most of it was redacted, and they explained the unredacted portions read literally: the Stillwater disappearances exhibit patterns inconsistent with human abduction. Evidence suggested that the involvement of unknown entities or forces associated with the St. Croix River, and they found a symbol on the letters that predated modern mapping conventions and appeared to denote like a hazardous boundary. And they said vividly that Detective Alan Pierce's involvement remained clearly unexplained, and they needed further investigation. And the redacted sections were significantly longer than expected. And they said during the sonar scans, technicians noted something unusual, like the water near the riverbed dropped sharply. They said it was like 58 degrees in spots, and then all of a sudden dropped to 41 within a span of only 12 feet. And they said that such a drop like that was impossible without natural springs or an underwater vent. But divers did search and they couldn't find it. Couldn't find a vent. So Instead, they wound up reporting it as something else, and they reported feeling like they were being watched. And one diver surfaced earlier, and he said that he was shaking and he refused to go back down. And when they asked him what happened, he said there was something down there. It wasn't a fish or a person, something else. It moved like it was waiting. And he said after that, he quit the dive team the next day and he didn't return. And that's compelling evidence that whatever's going on is definitely different than and supernatural or something. But 2 weeks after that container was recovered, they found another letter that arrived literally at the police station, and it was addressed directly to Detective Laura Merrick. It was the same kind of paper, ink, and wax seal, but the message inside was different. It wasn't a symbol or a warning, it just told her that you're looking in the wrong direction. And she said that she stared at the letter for a while and she whispered to herself and was trying to figure out which direction to go in. And she remembers Agent Hale answering to her and telling her that it wasn't the river that we needed to look at, it was the shore. So after that, Hale literally ordered like a full sweep of the shoreline. They weren't just aiming for the water anymore, they were aiming for the land. So they got like cadaver dogs and ground penetrating radar deployed, and they literally used drones to scan the area from above. And they said on the third day, a dog alerted near a cluster of old trees that like the soil had been disturbed. Wasn't like nothing there. There hadn't been no recent rainfall or anything, but it was fresh. Like somebody had literally found a wooden box buried like deep within that section, and it had compass, a pocket knife, a badge, and a notebook. And they said that the notebook and the badge literally belonged to Detective Alan Pierce. And the notebook contained all his final entries. And they said that on the last page that they read, it said, it's not the river that takes them, it's what lives between the river and the land. It waits in the boundary and it waits in the crossing. And the page was literally dated 3 days before his death. And so that's like was really compelling evidence that they found, and they were so confused. So when they found the notebook in the buried box, it was water damaged and the pages were warped. They said it was stained with soil, but enough of it was literally legible that you can construct Pierce's final weeks before he had passed. And they said that the handwriting deteriorated over time. It was steady at first, but then it increased erratically, and it had looked like it was written by someone who hadn't slept in weeks. And they said one entry stood out to them the most. It was the river. They said the river is not the danger, the river is only the doorway, and the danger is what stands on the threshold. And another one of his journals said it watches from reeds, it waits for ones who hear it. And the final entry, dated 3 days before his demise, it said, I saw it again and it knows my name. And after they read the notebook 3 times, Detective Hale literally closed it and she said, we're not dealing with a person at this point. And Hale literally introduced a theory and she called it the boundary hypothesis. And according to her, the symbol was a boundary marker. It was it was placed on the riverbed at a crossing point. So you shouldn't go beyond this point, but if you did, this is where disappearances would occur when victims crossed it or were lured across the boundary that he had created. And they found the boundary in the 1980s. Pierce did, and someone or something used it to continue his pattern. And Merrick was not convinced at this point. And she said, you're talking like this is supernatural. And she said that Hale shook her head and she said, I'm talking like this is unknown. There's a difference. It's unexplainable at this point. And Evan Laird's camera was found in his bathtub still recording this. And the footage was dark, grainy, and disoriented, but the audio was clear. Video began with Evan pacing his living room, breathing heavy, said it would stop if I didn't go back, and he muttered, "They said it only follows if you cross." And I imagine I connected across the border that had been created at the shoreline. He turned toward the hallway and they said that you said you lived here before. And the same words Rachel spoke on a recording. And they said that in the recording, the camera jerked violently as if Evan had been pulled backward, screamed, but it wasn't in pain. It was like shock. And he had said in the recording, "Who's here? Who's?" And as soon as he said who's, it's like his voice got cut off. And then you hear a loud thud and you see the camera falling sideways. And at this point, the lens cracked, but you could still hear the low, breathy, familiar voice. It said Evan, the same voice that said Rachel's name and Lucy's name, and also the same voice that called to Pierce. And when the video ended with the sound of water splashing, it wasn't in the apartment, but it was somewhere distant, echoing like you could hear the river in the recording. And after they reviewed the footage, they ordered a second sweep of the shoreline, and they were focusing on the area where the buried box had been found. And they found footprints. They weren't human or animal. They said that the prints were elongated, narrow, and deep, as if something tall and heavy had made these footprints. They said that the stride was too lengthy. It was over 5 feet. And they said that prints led from the water's edge to the tree line and then stopped abruptly, as if whatever it was stepped onto the earth and then vanished out of midair. And they said it was unexplainable and it was bizarre. It's nothing they ever experienced before. And the Polaroid that they found submerged in a container was a re-examining and they used advanced imaging at this point for the technology. And they said that when the shadows were lifted through the imaging techniques, they said the second figure came through even clearer this time, and they described it as tall. It was 7 feet long or 7 feet tall, and its limbs were long, almost spindly. And they said its posture was unhuman, rigid and unnatural, and its head tilted at an angle no human neck could ever achieve. And they said that when they looked at his eyes, it's like their eyes reflected light like an animal's. Kinda like how you see a fox or a wolf or even a cat, and how their eyes reflect light when you in the dark. But they said that the most disturbing detail from this was the figure was standing behind Pierce, but Pierce had no sign of fear whatsoever. Like he wasn't running or turning. He wasn't even reacting. It says if he didn't know it was there, or worse, as if he did know it and wasn't afraid that it was there. So they said that when the divers returned to the riverbed, retrieved the container for further analysis, they found it had been shifted. It wasn't mildly shifted either. It had moved 30 feet upstream. The chains were still attached, the rocks were still anchored, but the container had been dragged like against the current, and it left a deep trench in the riverbed. And they said the trench was smooth as if it carved by something with immense strength, something that was inhuman. And they said that one diver literally refused to go back there. He said it wasn't dragged, it was carried. That was what he believed. And Hale at the time overlaid the 1884 river map onto a modern satellite image. And the symbol that they were found, the boundary marker, it aligned perfectly with the area where all the victims had vanished previous years. But there was something else that they couldn't explain. The map literally showed a second symbol. It was identical, but on the opposite shore. It was like a mirrored boundary, a crossing point, and they were wondering, like, what does this mean? And they literally, it means whatever is taking them isn't coming from the river, it's coming from the land on the other side. And, but they said that land is just a forest. And they said it wasn't a forest in 1884. Historical records revealed that in the late 1800s, it was originally a small settlement, existed on the opposite shore. It was like a logging camp, and it was actually Pierce's Crossing, named after Samuel Pierce, an ancestor that had been related to Detective Alan Pierce, the one who went missing. And they said the settlement was abandoned after a series of unexplained deaths, and the survivors there called it something like walk the boundary at night. And the settlement was eventually erased from maps because they wanted it was like a cover up or something. But even though they erased it, the symbols still remain there. And they said 2 days after discovering the second boundary marker, a letter arrived at the police station, and it was addressed directly to Detective Laura Merrick and also Special Agent Rebecca Hale, the two that were detectives at the time on this case. And it had the same ink and the same paper and the same wax seal as the previous letters. But inside was a sentence and it said, "You crossed it too." And they folded the letter slowly and they literally told each other, like, it knows we're looking at it. And they felt a chill and they felt overwhelmed and they were wondering what it wants and why does it have to follow people. And they literally proposed uh crossing the boundary, not metaphorically, but they literally wanted to because they wanted to know what was on the side. And Hale said we need to understand what Pierce saw, but he said that Detective Merritt argued that it was reckless and dangerous and even suicidal. But Special Agent Hale literally said 5 people are missing. We have no bodies, no suspects, no leads. They had nothing to go off of. But they said the only consistent element is this boundary that everybody keeps talking about. And she said that if we don't cross it, we're never going to know what happened to them. And in the end, she said that finally, Agent Merrick finally agreed with her. And not because she believed any of this, but because she was there because she was overwhelmed by the disappearances and she wanted answers too. So they said that they went out at 2:13 a.m. time that Rachel's recording began, and they said the river was calm and the air was cold. Fog was clinging to the water like a living thing, and they brought up with them a thermal camera, and they brought carried with them Pierce's notebook and a flashlight. And they said that when they walked along the shoreline and walked up to the boundary marker, they found a cluster of old stones and they were arranged in a circle, and the circle felt older and heavier. They said it was like it was really thick, and they remember hearing something. And Merrick literally asked, "Do you hear that?" And Agent Hale at the time, she nodded and said, "Yeah, it's like a faint sound, like breathing coming from the trees. Not human breathing, but something deeper and slower." And that's when they stepped across the boundary. And they said that at that moment, when they stepped across the boundary, it's like everything stopped. The forest on the opposite shore was silent. It was unnaturally silent. There was like nothing, no wind, no insects, or moving. And they said that the trees were really tall and thin, and the branches twisted like skeletal fingers. And they said on the ground, it was like soft and spongy, as if the soil had absorbed way too much water. And they said that when they scanned the area with thermal cameras, there was nothing. They couldn't find any heat signatures or anything. But when they pointed the flashlight towards the trees, they found footprints and they were large and deep, but they were leading into the forest. And they were the same exact footprints found near the river. So they followed them out of curiosity. And they said that they led to a clearing. It was large and circle, perfectly symmetrical, like impossible, as if it was carved out intentionally. And when they arrived, in the center, there was a wooden structure and it had a crude frame made of branches and it was like lashed together with rope. And hanging from the frame, they found objects, all the objects that they originally found that were inside of that container under the water, the ones that have been missing. And they were said it's like they were collecting trophies and they didn't want to believe it. And it was like they had landmarkers in these objects. And so then they heard a sound. The trees snapped and it broke the silence. And they said that when they turned around and they had their flashlights out, There was something at the end of the clearing. They said it was tall and thin and motionless, like its limbs were too long and its posture was too rigid. And they said its head tilted at an impossible angle. And when they raised the thermal camera, it showed nothing. It literally showed no heat, no body, no life. But something was literally there. They said that they could see it, but couldn't pick it up on thermal. And they said that when the figure had stepped forward, the ground had shook under them. And they said that a voice literally echoed through the clearing. It wasn't from the figure, but from everywhere. And it was Merrick. And her blood literally ran cold. And it literally, mumbled under her breath, "How does it know my name?" And then it called for Hale, and Hale stepped back. And she remembers her eyes being wide. And the voice sounded the same exact as the one on the recording, same one that called to all the other people previously, Rachel, Lucy, and Evan, and even the same one who whispered to Pierce. And they said when the figure moved closer, the ground kind of like broke open beneath them like a wooden frame. And they said that water surged upward, and not like river water, but something darker and thicker. It was like a black liquid. And they said that the air filled with a smell of rot. And they grabbed each other and they said, "This has to be the doorway. This is the boundary. This is the doorway that they were talking about." And they said when the figure reached toward them, they stumbled backwards, but Hale was so pressured she couldn't move, and she just stared at the figure. And Merrick said her eyes were wide open, as if she was seeing something that Merrick couldn't. And she said, "It's not taking them; it's they're following it." And Merrick said, "What? What are they following? Are they following it willingly?" And they said that when the figure extended its hand and Hale stepped forward, Merrick remembers screaming, telling her, "No, don't do that." But Hale didn't stop. And Merrick said that she remembers her eyes filling up with tears and saying, "I understand now." Pierce understood too. And said, "What are you talking about?" And it said, "It's not killing them, it's calling them." So Merrick literally grabbed Hale's arm, and Rebecca, she said, "Rebecca, don't." And Hale pulled free, and she said, "Rebecca, who?" "I'm Hale." And she said that she stepped out of the darkness and the ground closed behind them, and the figure had vanished, and the clearing fell silent. And it was like it never even happened after that. And they said that they ran back to the river, and their breath was dragging and their heart was pounding. But they said that when they crossed the boundary and stumbled onto the shoreline and collapsed, that when backup arrived, it was like everything never happened. It was like they had no evidence, no proof. There's no signs of anything like this ever happening. And so they classified it as an incident. And Merrick literally left. She quit, and the case was closed, like officially. And they said that Merrick wrote in her final report that there was nothing ever submitted. You know, it said that the river does not take people, the boundary does, and once you cross it, you cannot come back. That Hale crossed, Pierce crossed, and the others crossed, and now it's calling me too. But 3 months later, Merrick received a letter in the mail, same paper and ink, same wax seal, and inside was a single sentence: "Left her behind." Merrick moved out of the Stillwater, and she never returned. And there's no evidence to this day of anything like this happening. There's no proof. And they said that the letters stopped. They stopped receiving them, and all the disappearances stopped. And they don't know to this day anything about it. They don't know any explanations, but they said it's covered up, and they explained that it's there's no evidence of this ever occurring. And it just everybody quit. They quit the case, they quit looking, and that's just wild. But you guys made it this far and you really liked my videos and you want to subscribe and like, go ahead and leave it down in the comments. If you made it this far, down in the comments, just comment "left behind," and I'll know that you made it this far. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.